Out in the deep, dark depths swim monsters beyond comprehension. They sit around drinking meths, honing their perception. When they spot an unwary creature, they will rise up fast and underneath. Surprise is their primary feature, followed closely by their teeth. I once saw such a monster strike out on the Pacific Rim. It had a whopping big spike and an evil looking grin. It grabbed an orca and pulled it down to the abyss. You wouldn't see that in Mallorca, and if you could, you'd give it a miss. I saw another one out in the Atlantic. It looked like a giant bee. Its prey was getting frantic as it struggled to get free. Sailors say the stories are just a guess. They don't know what lies in store. They compare them all to Loch Ness and dismiss them as folklore. But I am a creature of the sea. I spend a lot of time out there. I know what I see, and I know the monsters of nightmare. This is West Coast Sasquatch Research. By way of this little introduction, guess who my special guest is today? None other than Adam McGirr, the Vice President of the British Columbia Scientific Cryptozoology Club. That's right, the freshwater serpent hunters. Please make welcome Adam McGirr. Hey Adam, how are you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for having me, Gerry.
I am very pleased to have you. I've been really looking forward to having a conversation with you. And I know that you're a technical writer. I will not attempt to explain what that is because I believe it would take a technical writer to explain what a technical writer might be. So instead, I'll ask you, how did a technical writer get the call to be a cryptozoologist?
Okay, well, yeah, basically technical writing, it's like training, corporate training, or writing, sometimes writing manuals or job aids or explaining computer systems to employees at a company. And truth be told, I was a cryptozoologist before I was a technical writer.
Oh, okay.
Because I've been interested in cryptozoology since, I was probably 10 or younger.
Mm-hmm. Any particular favorite?
Well, I would always check out books from the library, and I had, the Loch Ness monster and, Bigfoot and everything, kind of the classics that you discover when you're a kid. And I was definitely into King Kong and all those other things that you get into. And I think for me, it was this fascination with the possibility that there were creatures out there, unexplained, that, that you could find out about. That's what sparked my curiosity with subjects like Sasquatch, Ogopogo, Cadbrosaurus, and ultimately led to me becoming involved with the British Columbia Scientific Cryptozoology Club.
Now tell me, Paul LeBlanc was one of the original founders of the BCSCC. He was an oceanographer, was he not, who studied Cadborosaurus for a number of years, taking reports and listening to stories and however. But wasn't it a writer from the Victoria Daily Times who blew the lid off Caddy, so to speak? He published an article in 1993 I can't think of his name now, but I think he was the J.W. Burns of Cadborosaurus.
Archie Wells, probably
Archie Wells. Could you tell me about those days?
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, you touched on Paul LeBlanc. I just want to say, I think Paul was a really special guy. He was a co-founder of the BC Scientific Cryptozoology Club, along with John Kirk, who is still, our de facto leader and involved in all sorts of interesting things. But Paul LeBlanc, he lived on Galliano. He was a well-respected oceanographer, and he worked at UBC for a number of years. He translated also a number of books because he spoke many different languages, and he was just well-loved, I think. And unfortunately, he passed away in, I believe, 2019. But I had a chance to catch his presentation at the Vancouver Aquarium. Actually, he came down to do a kind of a fun talk on Cadborosaurus, and he's basically retired his sailboat. He used to take his sailboat around Galliano, and he came to the mainland for a presentation on sea monsters, because there was a sea monsters exhibit at the Vancouver Aquarium that we were both involved in, of course, separately. And it just great storyteller beyond his work with the university, but basically the world authority on the subject of unidentified Cadborosaurus sea serpents in British Columbia.
Well, I know that they had a lot of sightings out around the Gulf Islands, and what a perfect place for him to have her headquarters for something like that.
So I think Paul, along with another associate, they ended up putting forward a paper where they submitted a scientific name for Cadborosaurus, or the unidentified sea serpent off the Pacific coast of British Columbia. And the name that they put forward was Cadborosaurus willsi, Willsi. And a lot of people, if you're a cryptozoology enthusiast, you might know where this name comes from. The willsi is a reference to, I believe his name is Archie Wills of the 1930s Victoria Daily Times. And it was Archie Wills, who was an editor and journalist at the Victoria Daily Times, that really he adopted the name Cadborosaurus, and he also kind of promoted, or he published, obviously, several articles about Cadborosaurus in the Victoria Daily Times. And at that time in British Columbia, it was a little bit of an exciting time. There's new species, lots of whales, of course, you can imagine.
But after this chap published in the paper, didn't sightings sort of take off after that? I mean, old sightings and new sightings, and people just wanted to talk about it more so. And so that's why I refer to him as the J.W. Burns of, Caddy.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's accurate, and I think it was in 1937 that the famous Naden Harbor carcass, which you can Google to see a photo of this carcass that was recovered from a sperm whale. When you're talking Cadborosaurus, that photo is basically your equivalent of the Patterson-Gimlin film.
Yeah, and I have seen that. A number of times. It's really amazing for sure. But tell me, you're the vice president of the British Columbia Scientific Cryptozoology Club, of which I'm also a member. Tell me, how did the club come about? Where did LeBlanc run into Kirk and the other co-founder? And was it just an interest in these aquatic creatures, or was there a bigger agenda? Or
Yeah. So my understanding is that Paul LeBlanc and John Kirk, they met together in the Vancouver area along with another fellow. His name was James or Jim Clark. And I never
Mm-hmm.
met Jim. He was before my time. I was only in 1989. I was 5 years old, so I hadn't made it all the way out to British Columbia yet. But the original fellows of the BCSCC were Paul LeBlanc, John Kirk, and Jim Clark. And unfortunately, my understanding is that Jim Clark unfortunately passed away the same year or the year after the BCSCC was founded, and that John and Paul kind of committed to, I feel like I'm describing the Beatles here, John, Paul, Ringo.
Yeah,
Jim.
there's always that guy that gets left out because you can't remember his name. He used to play drums before Ringo. Peter Best. Yeah. But,
anyways, yeah, in 1989, that was really when they got started. And I believe through UBC and a number of different kind of areas that they were interested in, Lake Okanagan, Lake Champlain, some of the lesser known lakes that have had legends of lake monsters. But then also, Sasquatch, British Columbia being a hotbed for Sasquatch activity and research. But then around the world, kind of connecting the Russian Almas or the Australian Yowie, the different mysterious species in Vietnam, or like orang pendek and that kind of thing, to really try to add a little bit of a voice of kind of scientific reason and
yeah. I mean, I believe at the time there was the International Cryptozoology, whatever the title was, and that's defunct now, I believe. So the BCSCC is probably the largest cryptozoological club or organization in the world at the moment.
Yeah, I think you're talking about the International Cryptozoology, a club or a symposium. And again, this was like a little bit before my time of involvement. The International Society of Cryptozoology. It was actually a fairly well kind of attended, and one of its presidents was Bernard. I'm gonna, I believe, mispronounce his last name, but Houlemans. He is considered the father of cryptozoology and wrote a number of different books on the subject. And
so you were saying that the club evolved into studying various cryptids, because I imagine at the beginning it was just lake serpents was what the club was based on when it first started. If correct me if I'm wrong.
Well, actually, when I joined, the first time I met John, I think, was at a Sasquatch symposium at the Vancouver Observatory, the planetarium, the Vancouver Museum in Kitsilano. It was a Sasquatch symposium, and it must have been 2000. I want to say maybe 2005. It's a good while ago now.
That's a while, yeah.
Yeah, definitely known them for about 15 years. And so they had an exhibit going on there at the museum, and John and there were a couple other speakers. That was my first introduction to kind of like the BC Sasquatch community. And I quickly, I joined the BCSCC, and then I think I kind of was interested in taking over the website. Actually, I got involved in, converting some of the older website files, and I wanted to make sure that the website stayed updated and accessible. So We established, bcscc.ca, and I helped to put it up onto like a, kind of WordPress platform. And by doing that, I got to go through this huge list that John and the other members of the BCSCC are generally very detailed in their notes.
Hence the insertion of scientific in the name.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
go ahead. Yes. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, that's okay. I mean, just to throw out a couple. I mean, Mokele Mbembe in the Congo kind of area of Africa is, it's a living dinosaur type creature that.
You deserve kudos just for being able to pronounce that.
Yeah, well, I mean, as I say, my pronunciations, I apologize to any native speakers of the language, but John, I think, has been involved in the search for that creature. It's, the rumor is that it's a dinosaur-like animal, and I feel like it's always important to acknowledge that whenever we're talking about these kind of dinosaur type creatures, if it's a sea serpent, or even, in terms of Sasquatch, like say like an early hominid or relative hominid. Mm-hmm. I think it's really important to acknowledge that there are some stories that come from cultures that are kind of like indigenous to the areas that these stories come from. And we, as like our culture, we try to make sense of or interpret older stories that they may or may not belong to us, or they may not be, we might not be able to reconcile some of these stories with an actual living, breathing animal. Like, we may never track down the Loch Ness monster, mm-hmm. or the Mokele Mbembe. And I feel like it's just really important to respect cultural traditions, especially in British Columbia, indigenous cultural traditions, and the stories of Ogopogo or Lake Okanagan before settlement, and Sasquatch as well, mm-hmm. in different indigenous cultural traditions. I wonder, Gerry, what do you think about that topic?
Well, I can identify with it. The serpents, that's rather a new interest for me. For a short time now, I'm pretty well immersed in the Sasquatch camp. But I understand what you're saying because of the situation with the indigenous people, and how difficult it is to get them to open up and speak about a creature like Sasquatch. And I remember running into a chap up on Hope there on American Creek, where myself and Tom Steenberg were riding along, and we met him on the side of the road, and he was up there collecting stones or whatnot. And he turned out to be a hereditary chief of a band from Prince George. He was down here living in Hope at the time. And he gave us a little bit of a sermon on how to see a Sasquatch, You've got to be in the right frame of mind. It helps doing a sweat lodge thing beforehand. And if you go out in the woods, you will see one after that, but you've got to be sort of light of heart and light of mind and be open for the experience. Well, a lot of people have the experience without doing a lot of that. But that doesn't really give us any more of an understanding of the creature. Have a hard time adapting into their way of thinking about these creatures, where we have a more scientific approach, they have a more spiritual approach. And sometimes I think their approach is, to me, has a more appeal to it all the time. I don't believe in paranormal stuff with flying saucers and Sasquatch and all of that. But I do believe there might be something special about these creatures, should they exist, that would explain why we have such a difficult time in finding them purposely, because most people seem to find them just totally by accident anyway. But I mean, no one wants to listen to me prattle on about this. They're here to listen to you. But so I had to ask you, which is your preferred cryptid for study, a woodland critter or a lake monster?
Well, I mean, I like to consider myself, like I said, a fan of the classics, and it was, like the Loch Ness Monster and Bigfoot that got me into this, and obviously living in British Columbia, I came to know about Ogopogo and Lake Okanagan, and that's one that John Kirk, are one of the co-founders. He has spent a lot of time on Lake Okanagan, a lot more than I have, certainly, and been involved in a number of different expeditions and different television recordings that have taken place around there. And for me, I mean, I love the Okanagan as a region. We're heading up to Vernon in July and looking forward to it. Might do a little spotting at the lake, but I wouldn't mount a Ogopogo expedition with hundreds of thousands of dollars if I had that, to mount an expedition with. Sasquatch, I think I could probably, in terms of being like BC's, number one cryptid, I think it's pretty easy to make that claim. Again, with all due respect to Indigenous traditions, there are so many different areas in BC where whether or not it's recognized as Sasquatch or something similar is reported over the years. And I think a lot of people who, if you're just starting your exploration of the subject of Sasquatch in British Columbia, it can be quite mind-boggling, the history of incidents and dates and figures and activities. And Gerry, I know you have a mind for a lot of these names, and John Kirk has a extraordinary memory, and again is a great storyteller like Paul LeBlanc. Just hearing about some of the early figures that were involved, like John Green and Renee DeHinden
and Bob Titmus, and
the early. That's really how you get into the topic, is to learn about the people who were doing the research.
Well, you see, that's exactly what I'm doing here with these podcasts. I didn't want to start a podcast to talk about Ogopogo or Sasquatch or whatever. There's enough of those out there, I wanted to talk about something that I find equally as interesting, and that's the people who do the research, because that's been a pet project of mine for a long time now, because I'm like a lot of people from the old days, and the old days meaning back at the turn of the century, on Bigfoot forums and such, that pretty well, would puke if they had to read another encounter with Sasquatch, because there's nothing new to report. So I found that the characters, out of boredom or whatever, who attended that forum, they were very interesting people from all walks of life. And it's sort of made me very curious about how they got into it. I know how I got into it, but that's another podcast for another time. As far as which I would prefer, woodland critters or lake monsters, that's, I don't know. Would that be that hard a decision? I mean, if you got an invitation to go out on a boat on a lake for an entire day, or go slogging through some midge-infested swamp up on North Harrison looking for under the small growth for a footprint, which would you choose? I think the answer is kind of obvious, I think. But no, Squatch holds a certain place in my heart, for certain.
I think Gerry touched on it there, in the sense that squatching, as much as I hate to use that term, but Sasquatch research is hard work.
Yep.
And our mutual colleague, Thomas, who I'm sure listeners of this podcast need no introduction to, Thomas Steenberg, in terms of being somebody who is out in the field and, covering ground. I know you've been out there, and I think having an interest in kind of being off the beaten path is certainly a requirement for this type of work. But I definitely can't claim to have spent nearly as much time out in the true wilds of British Columbia as any of you guys have.
Well, I wanted to ask you, how many BCSEC expeditions have there been, and how many have you personally gone out on?
Well, I mean, there were obviously quite a few when I was a younger member, and I mean, I was still in school when I joined the BCSE. Later on, I actually became involved in an investigation on Vancouver Island into a small lake. It's called Cameron Lake, and it's between Parksville and Port Alberni.
Yeah,
on the island, and there's a lot of history around this lake. It's very cold, and there were reports of a creature for a while there. There was like a little flurry of activity of different people who had been driving the highway.
What sort of activity? Are we talking Sasquatch or?
No, in the water, in the lake.
Oh, okay. Yep.
But actually, funny that you mention it, that area also has been known over the years for some Sasquatch activity. There have been Sasquatch sightings noted along that highway, that basically the highway that takes you out to Port Alberni and then ultimately to Fino. There's obviously a history of Sasquatch activity around there. And also there's one of those kind of older traditional stories about the Horn Lake caves.
I've never heard of them.
From there.
Uh-huh.
Horn Lake is just north of Cameron Lake, and one of the topics that came up when we were doing our Cameron Lake kind of investigation is whether or not the two lakes could be networked with a series of caves and underground kind of aquifers, aqueducts, underground caverns, essentially. Because that is the geography of that part of Vancouver Island. It's known as, I think, karst topography, a lot of caverns.
So what's the largest expedition that you've gone on to this date?
That one, surprisingly, for a small lake, ended up garnering quite a lot of attention. And, the island news came out, and there were a couple of different news channels on the day that we were doing our work on Cameron Lake. I think we ended up on all the local news channels, and then CTV called me.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, it was not the next day, but it was a few days after. They wanted to talk about it, so it was CTV Canada AM. I was on to talk about the Cameron Lake creature, and I think people again liked the story of it's a small town, it's a mysterious lake with a lot of history. There was a train crash, possibly a plane crash around this lake, and just this kind of classic story of like a lake monster in the woods maybe got a lot of people excited. So it was really fun for me to be a part of that. And, I was kind of, honored to be on camera and on TV. And that's something that is kind of interesting for folks getting involved with cryptozoology, is that you may at some point need to make a decision about, appearing on camera on TV or expressing your opinion in a public forum, even on social media, about, your beliefs.
Yeah, that stuff can come back to haunt you.
That's right. I mean, there is so much animosity and so much aggression, unnecessary aggression, in my opinion. And I personally, I don't participate in a lot of the message boards or social media on the subject for that reason, and just because there's no time.
Yeah, well, Tuesday the 15th, I'll be putting up the podcast I did with Thomas, and we touched on that subject about, the infamy of it all, dealing with the news, press, and documentarians and stuff like that. And that's a quite interesting subject all on its own. Hey, has the BCSCC ever teamed up with another group for an expedition, like the BFRO or something like that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think in terms of the BFRO, we have partnered up over the years. Certainly, our members know their members. And I think Jason Zackerson.
Yes.
Usually the guy that I think of. I believe is, BFRO affiliated. Correct me if I'm wrong, but Jason is, when I think of like a intrepid kind of like BC Sasquatch researcher, like the Thomas Steenbergs of the world, I put Jason in that category. He's out there. I think he gets out.
He's the real deal, you could say.
Yeah, well, he's got the beard to show for it too.
Oh, ZZ Top stand-in. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Because I know Jason got a little thing on the go himself with the BFRO, or some singular members of the BFRO, not the organization in total. I don't. Have you ever heard about the the black lizards in Pitt Lake?
I think I may have, but I think I heard about it as black salamanders.
Yes, yeah.
Okay. And to be honest, that is a subject that is of interest to me, because I'm interested in, salamanders and reptiles. And I guess going back to that, childhood fascination with dinosaurs and also whales, and I always like to learn about all these different creatures, but salamanders are particularly interesting, and the way that they can live, I think, in really damp areas or even underwater. So obviously you don't see them very often, but as I've heard it, there was actually a member of our group by the name of Barry. I don't know, Gerry, if you remember Barry Blount.
Oh, very well.
Yeah, bless him.
I met him at one of the meetings of the BCSCC over on Greenpoint. I attended one of the functions, and I met Barry there. He was very new to it all then, and went on to become very good friends with him. Yeah. Anyway.
Well, I just wanted to say he was one of the ones who first told me actually about the black salamanders. I think it was in the area of Chilliwack Lake and Green Drop Lake and Lindeman Lake.
Yes, he was trying to figure out, I believe at the time, where Green Drop Lake was. I believe they changed the name to Cougar Lake or something. And anyway, it sort of stymied his efforts, because he wanted to go in and visit this place. He never did make it. He never did find it.
Well, it is marked on the maps. There is a Green Drop Lake out near Chilliwack Lake, and yes. I'm not sure if it's the same one or there could be a different one, but I think in that region, basically, the story goes that there was like a section of boardwalk, and somebody was coming along to replace the boards that had been kind of rotted away, and went to pull up a section of the boards and saw what looked to be, a 4 to 5 foot giant alligator but that was, darker in color. And when you think about, dark alligators in that kind of environment, a giant Pacific salamander is only supposed to grow about a foot long. There is a species of giant Pacific salamander here on the West Coast that grows about a foot long. But Asian giant salamanders can grow 4, 5, even 6 feet long with the tail and head and everything.
Well, this coincides more along the lines of what these reports from the north end of Pitt Lake are like. They're described as the size of alligators, And I've seen the black salamanders. I even commented on them in a past podcast. Except for the bulging eyes, they look like little dragons. They're cute little things.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in terms of an area that I think deserves further interest, if you're a cryptozoologist, especially in the British Columbia area, this rumor of giant salamanders, it would be really, really cool if we could get, a picture or evidence or something of confirmation of this. Because it would really represent a new species, a recognition of a new species in the province of British Columbia. And that's ultimately on the subject of Sasquatch or Ogopogo or Cabrosaurus or any of these. We can debate until we're blue in the face. We can argue about, what abilities or characteristics these animals have, but ultimately we're not there yet. We don't have confirmation that these are a species, and in my opinion we will not have confirmation until there is a carcass. The protection of those species is really conservation, and appreciation is really what I think this should be all about.
But it's hard to get government protection for a creature that you can't even prove exists, It's like a lot of people say they want to, have Sasquatch as a protected creature, hominid, whatever you wish to call it. But the only problem with that is that the scientific community refuses to go along with the idea that such a creature even exists. So you're sort of standing on pretty shaky ground.
Well, and I think ultimately it is, it can be a cart before the horse kind of situation. It is the truth that the greater community, the scientific community, and the public at large, I don't think would accept the existence of, a Sasquatch or another creature unless there was a type specimen. And when you're talking about the subject of Sasquatch and these other cryptozoological creatures, I think it's really important to remember, the basics of kind of biology, and the fact that, dinosaurs are extinct and that animals can't live for hundreds of thousands of years or anything. You need to have a sustainable population of Ogopogos or Cadbrosauruses or Sasquatch or whatever they are. You're talking about a community of animals, just like any other animal, that would need to be sustainable. So naturally, you should be able to recover a body at some point, or there should be. They should basically pass away like every other living creature does. And I think finding evidence of that without trying to hunt them, hunting, I think, is the wrong approach. There's a lot of TV shows and popular culture with people in monster trucks with shotguns and that kind of thing. That's a whole other topic.
Yeah, Bigfoot, hunting for Bigfoot. Listen, I want to ask you probably the most important question of the night. In 2 words, William Shatner. Now, I haven't seen the documentary that you did, but when you were making the documentary, did you get to work with him, or were you a donated clip that was dropped into the production?
Tell all. Well, I guess it was a little bit of both. Trying to remember. I don't think I signed like a NDA or anything for this.
Did you meet William Shatner? Did you get to call him Bill?
Well, I did refer to him as Bill during the time that we were making this, but no, Bill and I never were in the same room together, unfortunately. And again, for listeners who might not be familiar, it was a show.
What's the story?
Okay, it was a show called Weird or What with William Shatner. And there's been a number of these shows lately. In fact, I think Bill, as I refer to him, obviously.
Oh, yeah, you made it, man.
I think Bill, he's a colleague of mine. Bill is involved in a number of these different shows because of his early work. I believe he was involved in, the Twilight Zone.
Yeah.
A classic actor. So he filmed his parts, I believe it looked like, at a nice house in California. I don't know if it was his house or not, but we were talking about an incident in Australia where a boat had been capsized, and these folks had set out on a sailboat, and they were sailing the boat around Australia to move it to another port, and the boat was seemingly attacked, but there were still valuables on board, so it wasn't a pirate attack. And the company that was making this production with William Shatner contacted me to ask if I thought it could have been a giant squid.
Really?
Yeah. So, I mean,
he sought out your wizened advice on the subject.
Yeah, and I think probably through the BCSCC and my work, I've really, over the years of my involvement with the British Columbia Scientific Cryptozoology Club, it's up to each person, I think, up to each researcher to decide their own take on a subject, and to listen to all the different stories you hear, and don't be afraid to kind of like represent your own opinion. If you're not sure on something, it's okay, because a lot of science is about not knowing things. It's good to admit that. So I've always tried to be involved in things like the the Vancouver Aquarium I mentioned earlier with Paul LeBlond. I did some presentations there, and really trying to promote education and communication on the subject of these kind of creatures at a level that is not a joke.
I'm a full believer in that. I'm a full believer in what you just said.
So that documentary, I mean, it aired, I think, probably on the History Channel, and you can still find it if you have a subscription to the History Channel. It's on I think the episode is called Ghost Ship. And I speculated. I said flat out, I'm not officially a giant squid expert, and I'm also not an expert on the boating accidents or anything. But I provided a little bit of information about the giant squid and the colossal squid, and how they have been known historically to attack ships, or we're basically in the jurisdiction of the mythical, legendary kind of sea serpent, and are now a recognized, verified species. So the giant squid for me kind of represents that journey that we were just talking about, that a Sasquatch or a Cadborosaurus or anything else would need to take to be, to become truly, protected and recognized.
Mm-hmm. So somewhat akin to that is Sasquatch. Now we know Sasquatch has hoaxers galore, and there's a special place in hell for each and every one of them. Have the big lake serpents had hoaxers in the past?
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, hoaxing is another one of these subjects, hoaxing and cryptozoology. It really, unfortunately, it changes people's perception of the subject when something turns out to be fake.
Mm-hmm.
If there's a sighting that turns out to be just excitement, or it happens all the time on Lake Okanagan and Loch Ness, of course, being like the original, the original Loch Ness monster. There were numerous incidents of people. I think there was a famous one where a guy took it was an umbrella stand in the shape of an elephant foot.
Okay.
And he stamped that umbrella stand, elephant foot, along the beach of Loch Ness in Scotland, and then took pictures and claimed that Nessie was out for a beach day. And that's going back, interestingly, back to the 1930s. I think around 33, 34, when interest in the Cadborosaurus and our newsman Archie Wills in Victoria, BC, was becoming interested in Cadborosaurus. So I certainly think the excitement about the Loch Ness monster helped to ignite a little bit of local interest in what was going on in our waters.
Oh, it's wonderful for tourism. if nothing else, it's wonderful for tourism for certain. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, that's just another thing that I think we just have to acknowledge right off the bat, is that these creatures, these cryptids, Ogopogo, Sasquatch, have now been kind of adopted as unofficial mascots of British Columbia, and have been used in advertisements and all kinds of
sure. They're pets. They're pets. It doesn't matter if you're selling pipe tobacco or you're an Olympic symbol or whatever. And you're right. The problem is that people normalize a very abnormal thing in these creatures when they play down like that, or when they hoax. Or hoaxing diminishes people like you, me, or anybody who's really interested in the subject and spend their time and effort on this subject. And it's not just a yuck laugh, it is that, but I had a conversation with Thomas saying, maybe we shouldn't take all this so seriously. Maybe it's time to have a good laugh at all of this stuff, all of these cryptids and everything. But I feel that when someone pulls a hoax, people remember the hoax for years. Nobody remembers the story of someone who really believes they had an encounter, That disappears pretty fast, because there's always another story following it up quickly. But a hoax, the hoax, I mean, they're still talking about the mission hoax, and I don't know how many decades ago that was. But no, it diminishes, and it's something that people should watch out for who are getting into this field.
Well, I mean, it really is up to everyone as an individual to decide, what research you're interested in, and what, who you're going to follow, because there's so many personalities in this arena, and there's a lot of people who are really interested in the social media aspect or promoting themselves as a media expert or a regional expert on, Sasquatch. That there's numerous cases, and one of which I can think of, a guy who's had quite a lot of success, I would say, has a documentary on Netflix, and was doing tours in Alberta for a while. And it's you don't always want to listen to the loudest voice in the room, I guess.
No.
Is what I'm saying.
No, definitely not. I covered this rather extensively in the third podcast, the Sasquatch 101 Part 3, talking about the Sasquatch or Bigfoot community, of which there is no such thing. There's just a bunch of loosely affiliated characters full of ego, and some are full of lies. And, you got to have your skeptical glasses on. You can't just take anyone at face value. If they got something, ask for proof to back it up. Just don't take somebody's word for anything, because there are people out there who at the very least will exaggerate. That's the mildest sin, exaggeration. But it's a wild, woolly West out there when it comes to cryptids. So, keep your bar high for evidence, and always ask for proof of anything. So tell me, you're a VP. What are the duties of a VP in the BCSCC?
Well, I mean, I don't think the role is too clearly defined. Obviously, I wish it was my full-time job. I've often remarked that I wish I could just do cryptozoology full-time, and it's hard to make a living that way. There's a few people in this world who have successfully made a living, and usually it's through blogging or videos or writing books, and
book tours and conventions.
Yeah, the convention circuit, certainly that's another thing that, if you're new to the world of Bigfoot, then get ready to go to your first convention and then meet all kinds of interesting people.
Oh, yeah. It will not be boring. You will not be bored, not for 1 second.
Yeah.
And so getting back to cryptids, I try to avoid talking about the creatures themselves, because I'd rather concentrate on the researcher who's researching the creature.
Okay.
But I have to ask you, how would you describe Cadborosaurus? Good old Caddy. Should people want to keep an eye out on the lake or out on the Gulf Islands this summer?
Sure.
What should they be looking for?
Well, so traditionally, Cadborosaurus is described as, this classic kind of sea serpent with almost like a horse-like head and a body that is either looks like a big hump or several kind of coils, and just like Ogopogo, like different sighting reports have different characteristics. And I think it's really important to just acknowledge that, different people are going to see different things based on their distance and their, their vision and the weather and everything. And there are so many different characteristics that are attributed to Cadborosaurus, but a long neck and a big body in big proportions, 30, 40 feet are the basics of it. And I think that the ultimate question for me as a researcher is, we have to be aware of things like elephant seals and big sea lions, and we even have basking sharks in our waters around.
Quite huge. Yes, quite huge.
And they're massive. They're 40 feet long, and they were quite common, in fact, in the earlier days, in the 30s and 40s, before the fishing operations really kicked off in British Columbia. There you would see, apparently you could see hundreds of basking sharks, and I just have to kind of acknowledge, I think I kind of presented this theory at my presentation for the Vancouver Aquarium, which you can watch on YouTube, by the way. It's called Sea Monsters, Fact or Fiction.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of ended on the note that the basking shark essentially, to me, fits the description of Cadborosaurus. And if people were to see something like that at the surface, especially in the 30s or 40s, I think it could easily create the kind of excitement if they didn't know what they were
Yeah, sure. I mean, giant squid, kraken, and what have you. Yeah.
Giant sharks. Yeah.
Giant whale shark.
It is actually, the basking shark is the second largest freshwater fish after the whale shark, which is the first largest.
Oh, yeah. We got to throw one in for the Sasquatch crowd. They might be dozing off a little at this point. So let's turn to Harrison Lake. How many big guys like Caddy or an Ogopogo have been reported in that lake over the years? I know there had been reports.
Yeah, and I mean, this is another interesting one where we were talking about Vancouver Island and Cameron Lake being both a potential lake cryptid and a potential Sasquatch hotspot. And Harrison Lake has certainly become a kind of like a central point. I think if you're involved in Sasquatch research in British Columbia, Harrison Lake and the surrounding area is probably where you want to be. And there's just such a rich history of different sightings. And obviously your previous podcasts, John Green, a lot of that is the result of John Green and his early involvement in the subject. But in terms of creatures in the water of Harrison Lake, I think it's also important to acknowledge Harrison Lake is connected to the ocean by way of the Harrison River and then the Fraser River.
Mm-hmm.
And seals can swim up through the river, especially if they're hungry and they're catching salmon. And another topic that I've become very interested in is a sturgeon in the Fraser River.
Yes.
We have some of the largest sturgeon in the world in our river system. And every year there are sturgeon caught in British Columbia that are close to 100 years old.
Yep.
They could weigh 1,000 pounds. And, thinking of Harrison Lake and how deep and cold it is, and how close it is to the Fraser River where some of these massive sturgeon have been caught. I mean, I'd be really, really interested to, I know they do some sturgeon catch and release as part of the research program, conservation research program that you can get involved with. And I've always thought it'd be interesting to get involved with that.
Oh, I think that's fascinating. I mean, they're living dinosaurs. 12 feet long is no exception, They grow in a monstrous size and they're from another era altogether. And they're pretty fascinating. And you're absolutely right. If Harrison Lake is that deep, who knows what might be down there, Now, speaking of Harrison, I might be wrong, but I think that lake lizard reports, not Harrison, but let's say for the whole southern BC, that lake lizard reports in cumulative numbers could give the Sasquatch reports a run for their money down here. I'm quite surprised at the number of lake and sea serpent reports that there are out there.
Yeah, I mean, the number of different lakes in British Columbia that have a lake monster tradition or a history is truly astounding. And some obviously more than others, like Lake Okanagan being a huge lake and being populated area. There are a number of other lakes, like Cameron Lake on Vancouver Island, and several lakes on Vancouver Island, actually, that have different traditions. I do want to acknowledge again, Indigenous traditions around the lakes, and sometimes I think there's a little bit of a misdirected attempt to either adapt those stories into something that we can kind of understand and interact with. And then also the fact that British Columbia, some of these lakes are connected to the ocean. We have big fish like these sturgeon floating around in these lakes. So for the number of different lakes that have a reported creature, I would say there's probably only a small percentage that would really potentially have something that is, an unknown species.
Yeah, I have to admit at this point that, this subject excites me, and I'll tell you why. What we're talking about in general here today. Yeah, I see Caddy as an opportunity for young researchers to have an alternative cryptid or an additional cryptid for study. I think, it's a more reliable area of research. For one thing, unlike Sasquatch, it's harder to fake signs of Ogopogo or Caddy, and it's a lot more accessible to the average person. I mean, all you got to do is go to one of the big lakes and keep your eyeballs peeled, and who knows what you're going to see. So, I think that it excites me that way in involving younger people who might be interested in this kind of thing. Yeah, you can always go camping too and try to run into a Sasquatch, but I think it'd be more fun for kids for a day on the lake looking for Ogopogo. I want to ask you, did I not some years back hear a story from some investigatory group about Loch Ness who'd been studying Nessie for a long time, or an individual, and they threw in the towel? And they say they don't believe that Nessie exists. Now, I heard that on a news program some years ago, and I'm not sure if it was just one individual or whether it was a society or whatever who were investigating Loch Ness, but they finally threw in the towel and said, no, they don't believe there's anything in the loch.
I think I think I know what you mean. There is a man by the name of Steve Feltham.
Okay.
He's like a well-known kind of Nessie investigator who has spent, more than 28 years kind of tracking down the Loch Ness monster. I believe he lived on the shore of the loch for a number of years, and has basically devoted his whole life to looking for the creature over 20 years, setting up cameras, and he has the world record for a continuous kind of surveillance of the lake. And I believe this is who you're referring to a little while ago, who said that he was giving up the search, but then I'm also reading that he may be involved in a new film, a new documentary kind of short film that's coming out. So it's almost interesting to see some of these figures in cryptozoology become cultural icons like Rene Dahinden in his early work with the Sasquatch, as well as Lauren Coleman. Actually, shout out to Lauren Coleman in the International Cryptozoology Museum in Portland, Maine.
Yeah.
Who has always been a subject of voice of reason kind of on this subject. But those two, I believe, were the inspiration for John Lithgow's character in Harry and the Hendersons.
Harry and the Hendersons, yeah. You know, I think that the Pacific Northwest gives Sasquatch a pretty good place to hide from the masses. But on the subject we're talking about, I would think that the world covered with, 2/3 with ocean would give Cadborosaurus, a really good place to spend the rest of their lives in solitude. The ocean is pretty deep. There are creatures down there, I'm sure, that have not even been dreamt of yet, that never make it to the surface. Why do you think that these creatures live most of their life at sea? I mean, like they're like salmon. They only come in to visit every now and then, Cadborosaurus and Nessie or what have you. Do they use the ocean as a pretty nifty hiding place?
That's an interesting question, Gerry. I think it relates to what I was saying earlier about, if you have a real population of these creatures, you need to have a sustainable population, and they need to be able to reproduce. And that cycle for a lot of animals means, going from freshwater to saltwater, like, there's plenty of fish that do that. And even the sturgeons and things, and things like catfish as well, quite common in the UK. I think it's absolutely possible that there are animals that are swimming from the ocean into freshwater and are being seen where they're not expected to be seen.
Yeah.
And that can create a number of, obviously confusion and sometimes, false identification of a creature. Like in the case of Harrison Lake, for example, I think, I was talking about the seals and sturgeons and all kinds of different things that could potentially be in there. But there's no reason why an unidentified creature couldn't also be able to adapt from freshwater to saltwater.
That's interesting. Yeah. Of all the cryptids, would you say that Cadborosaurus is the most plausible of all the cryptids in BC?
All the cryptids in BC.
Yeah. I mean, these types of creatures were there before, like the plesiosaurus and such, and they're all documented through fossils and what have you. So did they ever go away? I mean, did all of the dinosaurs ever go away? Or is this something new, this Cadborosaurus?
I think that's a good question, Gerry, and it goes back to, the Loch Ness Monster and that classic image that people think of when they think of the Loch Ness Monster. You think of this long-necked, use the term plesiosaur or mosasaur, elasmosaur. There's a number of these dinosaurs that are basically long-necked swimming reptiles that have essentially become a stand-in for the image or idea of a lake monster or sea serpent for a lot of people. And I think there's tons of different reasons for that, like Jurassic Park, and even in the early days of like the 1930s, and people were learning about dinosaurs and what you think of a giant swimming creature, naturally, you're going to put two and two together. But to have a realistic kind of scientific discussion about it, we have to acknowledge that dinosaurs are extinct. I don't see it as a possibility that there is a surviving population of plesiosaurs or mosasaurs or any of those prehistoric creatures without, we can't really speculate on that without enough further evidence. And there's some exciting stuff with Cabrosaurus footage from Alaska where it seems like several creatures were spotted together, and that's getting into population territory, but we just don't know enough.
It's not enough there to make a case.
I think in terms of the most likely possible cryptid, I mean, the Sasquatch in British Columbia, forget about worldwide and other places where the Sasquatch has been seen. I think for me, why I became fascinated with the stories and the history of the subject of Sasquatch in British Columbia is because it seems so plausible, and I think it's really, really important to have skeptical goggles on and be using all of the modern kind of techniques of research and investigation when you're looking into especially older stories in BC about Sasquatch encounters. But when you start to if you start to read the books, and of course John Green is probably the best place to start with it, and start to familiarize yourself with the accounts. The more accounts you read, the more you start to think, there's got to be something here. There's something to this. And one question, probably the trickiest question somebody ever asked me about cryptozoology was, if the Patterson-Gimlin film was, imagine, hypothetically, if the Patterson-Gimlin film turned out to be a fake, turned out to be a hoax, would you still believe in Sasquatch in other areas, like in British Columbia? Like if we didn't have the Patterson-Gimlin film from Bluff Creek, California, and everybody knows what I mean by that.
Yeah.
Imagine that piece of evidence never existed. Where would we be at with Sasquatch in British Columbia, Gerry?
Well, I can only speak for myself on that, and that the Patterson-Gimlin film never made it or broke it for me one way or the other. What hooked me really was Rennie de Hinden's book, and that he wrote with Don Hunter, I believe his name was, and John Green's books, of course, which followed after that, and. I just thought, it's just possible. It's just possible. So many people have claimed to have seen these creatures that, isn't it worth looking into? And if you're wrong, you're wrong. The world doesn't come to an end. But I can tell you honestly right now that even if it's proven tomorrow that such a creature never existed, never will exist, it wouldn't bother me one bit. At least now the mystery is solved, and on to something else, kind of thing. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't lament it for very long, because our world is pretty small when it comes to travel methods and communications and stuff like that, but it's still a big Earth in mass, just in size. So I don't know. What do you think, Adam? Still more cryptids, out there to be revealed yet?
Absolutely. I mean, I think fundamentally an interest in this topic means an interest in the natural world and the world around you, animals and mysterious creatures. I think it's one of the oldest interests, probably, is what is out there, in the dark, or what's making that noise. It's really almost primal, I think, is what draws a lot of people to it. And you could get the opportunity to go up into the region around Harrison Lake and sit around a campfire, and for me it's can be restorative. Yes. And think about it like traveling into nature and, enjoying that time in nature, and not about trying to capture or
Absolutely.
conquer or, defeat or anything like that.
As I said, I've often said that you'll never regret the time you spent back in the backwoods. You won't regret it. I camp a lot at Harrison. I ATV a lot at Harrison. Mm-hmm. And I have to tell you, going back to what you say about the campfire, when that campfire is going at 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night, there's a part of you with your ear cocked to the distance to see if there's any strange vocalizations or anything.
Sure.
It's there. It's there. And the best times I ever had were on the trail with the UTVs with Thomas Steenberg and Bill Miller and who have you. They were the best times of my life. I never regretted it for a moment. And Barry Blunt, can't forget Barry. I never regretted it for a moment. And even if it's all fake tomorrow, I had good times. So tell me, Adam, where do you see the BCSCC going in the future?
Well, I mean, I know John is as dedicated as can be. I mean, his work, really the BCSCC quarterly newsletter is John's baby and has been for years. And I think is probably the longest running cryptozoology publication now, because there were a few, like you touched on, the International Society of Cryptozoology. There's been a couple pop-up kind of newsletters here and there, but the BCSCC quarterly, I believe he has the entire archives as well. And again, it speaks to that really detail-oriented, it's great when people in cryptozoology have all their facts and figures in a row, which John generally does. So, I mean, obviously, when you're getting interested in this stuff, you have to make a distinction between doing research, academically and through, it's okay to watch documentaries and make up your mind about them and read different books, and then going to, an actual lake like Lake Okanagan, or going to Harrison Lake and spending time out in the field and doing field work. And I think a lot of people, when they hear about the BCSCC, they expect a maybe a more formal organization, or, more formalized field trips.
Yes.
But it's really more of a network of like-minded kind of individuals that work together sometimes, or go out in the field with one another, and sometimes share information. And there's a lot of politics around, the latest kind of sighting reports and where they've happened and how you can find out about that. So it's, I think there's been so much interest in recent years because of, there's shows, and Bigfoot is everywhere lately, but you can't learn everything about this topic overnight, or even over a few years. And you can't barge your way into the kind of like the community of the people who have been working for a long time, 10, 15 years, or especially Indigenous communities. It can really kind of put people off, I think, the subject, if people are being, disrespectful, or not acknowledging that, there's a lot of history in this subject.
Oh, for sure. And everything that you said tonight, you had a lot of comments that were very insightful, I must admit. And I'm really glad that we had a chance to do this today, and I look forward to doing it again. As you listeners may or may not know, this podcast is based on Barbara Wasson's wonderful book, Sasquatch Apparitions, which she published back in 1971. Barbara's not with us anymore. She passed away. But in this book, she wrote about the researchers of the day and how their passions affected each of their lives to various degrees. Whether, it's Bob Titmus she's talking about, or the Four Horsemen, Thomas Steinberg, she knew all of them and all of them knew her, So it's my wish to carry on the idea of that book by recording conversations with researchers of this current day. I think that these people are as equally amazing as the creatures that they search for, if not more so. And I think we proved it today by having Adam McGirr on with us. And man, knocked it out of the park, Adam. Great show.
Thanks, Gerry. Thanks for having me.
Okay, dear listener, that about wraps it up for now. My name is Gerry Matthews. You can reach me at yellowcoyote@telus.net. Thank you for your interest, and until the next time, keep searching.